In a candlelit corner of Boston's most exclusive Italian restaurant, a 27-year-old waitress named Maddie Carver stood frozen. A diamond necklace dangling from the manager's trembling fingers pulled, somehow, from her own apron, while 64-year-old Eleanor Greer, the iron matriarch of a family no one in this city dared to cross, pointed one ringed finger at her chest and said the three words that could end her life: "She's a thief." Maddie had buried her mother 2 years ago, and she'd been waiting tables since dawn and studying nursing past midnight just to stay afloat. And now everything she'd fought to keep her dignity, her safety, maybe her breath was slipping away in front of a silent dining room. Eleanor's son sat at the head of the table, a man whose name was whispered in this city like a warning, a 37-year-old widower with eyes that had stopped feeling anything years ago. His men were already moving toward her, and then his little girl, 6 years old, autistic, a child who'd never once spoken to a stranger and clutched a stuffed otter against her chest, slid off her chair, tugged her father's sleeve, and spoke up in a small, broken voice that rang through the quiet room, revealing a truth that wasn't supposed to be known. The whole table went still. Nobody breathed, because what that child had seen changed everything. If a story about quiet dignity and the smallest voice in the room moves you, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. There is a truth that few people are willing to stop and truly look at, that the people who carry the deepest wounds inside them are often the ones who smile most gently at the world, and Maddie Carver was exactly that kind of person. Long before that fateful night in the restaurant, her life had already been a long chain of losses, each one something she had learned to fold neatly away and hide where no one could see it. Her father died when she was only 9, a heart attack striking him in the middle of a shift at the machine shop, and from that moment on, the small house in the suburbs of Boston held only a mother and daughter leaning on each other to survive. Her mother, Ruth, was a woman whose hands had grown calloused from cleaning offices for more than 10 years, yet she never once let her daughter see her collapse. It was Ruth who planted in Maddie's heart the words Maddie would later carry like a small lamp through the darkest nights: that dignity is the one thing in this world no one can take from you unless you hand it to them yourself. Maddie didn't fully understand the weight of those words until she was 25, when cancer appeared inside her mother's body like an uninvited guest, silent and merciless. The final months were a race Maddie knew she couldn't win, but she ran anyway. She still sat beside the hospital bed night after night, still held that thin hand until it slowly turned cold inside her own. When her mother passed away, the only thing she left behind wasn't money or property, but a thick stack of medical bills, numbers that made Maddie's heart tighten every time she opened an envelope. She didn't cry as much as people might have expected, because she understood that tears couldn't pay a debt, and debt didn't know how to wait for anyone. So Maddie threw herself into work in the way only people with nowhere left to retreat can do. By day, she tied her apron over the elegant navy blue dress that served as the uniform at the Italian restaurant Il Ponte in the heart of Boston, standing through shifts so long her legs went numb, memorizing the names of every wine, smiling at wealthy guests who had never had to worry about what they would eat the next day. When the restaurant closed, she didn't go straight home. She stopped by her evening nursing class, sitting in the last row with eyes stinging from lack of sleep, writing down every line about how to dress a wound, how to take blood pressure, how to comfort a frightened human being. Her dream of becoming a nurse wasn't some passing impulse. It had been born from the nights she spent beside her mother, wishing she knew more, wishing she could do more, wishing she could ease the pain in that hand during those final hours. Her apartment was in Dorchester, a small room on the 3rd floor of an old building, where the water pipes groaned through every winter night, and the sound of the train drifted in from far away like a sorrowful lullaby. She didn't have much, just a few uniforms, a stack of textbooks, and a photograph of her mother set on the windowsill. But she kept the place clean and orderly, because her mother had once taught her that being poor wasn't an excuse to let go. What made Maddie different wasn't that endurance, but the fact that beneath all the burdens pressing down on her shoulders, her heart still hadn't turned hard. Every evening after her shift, she often wrapped up the leftover bread and soup the manager allowed her to take from the kitchen, then placed it into the hands of the homeless man, who always sat curled up on the corner near the train station, an old man named Walter who had once been a carpenter before life turned its back on him. She called him by name, asked if he was cold, and sometimes stayed for a few minutes just to talk, because she understood that sometimes what people hunger for most isn't food, but the feeling of being seen as a human being. Maddie had never thought she was special. In her own eyes, she was only someone trying to live decently in a world that rarely offered decency in return. She had no idea that this quiet kindness, this dignity her mother had left in her keeping, was about to be weighed in a room full of powerful people, where a single accusation could crush everything she had struggled for so long to preserve. Less than 6 miles from Maddie's small apartment, yet in an entirely different world, there was a man whose name the whole city of Boston spoke in wary whispers, as if saying it too loudly would be enough to invite disaster. Sullivan Greer, whom people usually shortened to Sully, was 37 that year, and he held in his hands an entire network of power stretching along the docks of the North End, where every shipment that came ashore, every loading contract, and every dollar that moved through those old stone-paved streets bore, in one way or another, the mark of his hand. He wasn't the kind of man who flaunted anything. Sully didn't wear gold or silver. He didn't drive roaring cars. He never raised his voice. His power lived in silence, in the way he stepped into a room and every laugh and conversation naturally died away, in eyes as gray and cold as the sea in December, eyes no one facing him could ever truly read. He wore perfectly tailored dark suits, lived in a stone mansion behind towering iron fences, and ran his empire from an upper-floor office in a converted warehouse that looked straight out over the water. The men who worked under him understood one thing very clearly, that loyalty to Sully Greer was rewarded handsomely, but betrayal carried only one price, and that price was never negotiable. On a damp Thursday night in late November, as the bitter cold of winter began to settle over the city, that price came due. In the back room of the warehouse, beneath dull yellow lights spilling over the concrete floor, a man named Gus was dragged in by 2 of Sully's men and forced to his knees in front of him. Gus had once been someone Sully trusted, the man assigned to oversee the books for one of the peers. But over the past 3 months, he had quietly skimmed the numbers and diverted part of the cargo to a rival group trying to push into Greer territory. Sully didn't shout. He sat there with one leg crossed over the other, lightly turning the silver ring on his finger, and let the silence stretch so long that Gus began stammering out pleas before Sully had even spoken. When Sully finally did speak, his voice was low and even, without a single ripple of emotion, and he asked only one question, whether Gus knew what he hated most in this world. Gus couldn't answer. Sully stood, stepped closer, bent down until his eyes were level with the traitors, and said that what he hated most was wasting time on men who thought he wouldn't find out. His faint nod was the signal, and what followed was quick, cold, and measured down to the second, not a burst of rage, but a sentence being carried out. Sully turned his back before it was over, straightened the cuff of his sleeve, and walked out into the corridor where the night air drifted in cold and damp, while Frank Boyd, the right-hand man who had stood beside him for many years, silently handed him a white handkerchief. Across the city, the Greer name was passed from mouth to mouth like a warning, a story told in late-night bars, that you should never owe that family money, never lie to them, and absolutely never betray them. Some said Sully Greer had been born that cold. Others whispered that he had once been a different man, before something in his past killed the last soft part left inside him, but no one dared ask, and Sully never told. He returned to the mansion after midnight, took off his coat heavy with mist, and stood motionless for a while by the window, looking out at the city glittering with distant lights. And in that rare moment, across the face that always seemed carved from stone, there flickered something very much like the weariness of a man who had long ago forgotten when he'd stopped knowing how to feel anything at all. But there was one room in that mansion where even Sully Greer, the man who made an entire city hold its breath, entered with hesitant steps, and that was his daughter's room. Poppy Greer was only 6 years old, a small little girl with soft brown hair and wide eyes that were always fixed on a world only she could see. Poppy was autistic, and that meant she experienced the world in a way different from the people around her, more intensely, more sharply, and sometimes more painfully. Sounds that other people considered ordinary, a door slamming shut, a car horn out on the street, voices overlapping one another, came to Poppy like blades cutting into her ears, making her press both hands tightly over them, curl into the corner of a wall, and rock back and forth to soothe herself. She rarely looked anyone straight in the eye, not because she was afraid or cold, but because to Poppy, another person's gaze could sometimes be too many things rushing at her all at once. She spoke very little, and there were days when she didn't say a single word. but that didn't mean she had nothing to say. It only meant she chose to speak to the world through actions, through quiet gestures that people had to be patient and loving enough to read. The one thing Poppy never let go of was Otto, a stuffed otter worn soft with age. Its brown fur faded from being held too much, and she carried Otto everywhere as if she were carrying a piece of peace through a world that was far too loud. When Poppy was happy, she lined up her toys in perfectly straight rows by color, careful and absorbed. When she was uneasy, she pressed Otto against her chest and softly hummed a wordless melody. Sully had done everything power and money could do to reach his daughter. He had brought into the mansion the most expensive specialists, doctors whose degrees covered their walls, therapists introduced as the best in the Northeast. But one after another, they had disappointed him. Some looked at Poppy as a condition to be fixed, instead of a child who needed to be understood. Some lost patience when she didn't respond the way they expected, and one made the fatal mistake of calling his daughter a hopeless child right in front of him. Sully fired them, one after another, sometimes with a single cold sentence, sometimes with a look enough to make them pack their things in silence. But behind that anger wasn't the arrogance of a powerful man. It was the smoldering pain of a father realizing there was one thing in this world money couldn't buy and power couldn't force. And that was the moment his daughter would lift her head and look into his eyes. On many nights, Sully sat down on the floor outside Poppy's bedroom door, listening to her hum, and he, a man who had never known fear before the mouth of a gun or a spoken threat, found himself helpless to the point of breathlessness before one tiny living soul he loved more than his own life. The only person who seemed able to touch Poppy's world was Bridget Nolan, the nanny who was past 60, a gentle woman who had once been a special education teacher, someone who understood that patience was the key, not force. She knew when to step back and when to come closer. She knew how to sing the child to sleep in a warm, low voice when storms of feeling rolled in. But lately Sully had noticed that Bridget's steps had grown slower, that her hand trembled more when she poured tea, and that sometimes she had to grip the arm of a chair to stand up, a quiet sign he deliberately tried not to think about, because he didn't dare imagine what would happen to Poppy if one day the only anchor holding her steady no longer had the strength to remain by her side. While Sully carried on his shoulders the silent helplessness of a father, the woman who truly ruled the Greer name with an iron hand was his mother, Eleanor Greer, 64 years old, a lady with silver hair swept into a flawless chignon, and the bearing of someone who believed the entire world had been made to submit to her. Eleanor wasn't directly involved with the docks or the ledgers, but she was the hidden root beneath the empire, the one who decided alliances, the one who calculated every move so that the Greer family would grow stronger with each passing day, and in her eyes, humanity was divided into only two kinds: those who had value and those who existed only to be commanded. On an evening in early December, Eleanor reserved a table at Il Ponte to dine with several friends from high society, and walking beside her that night was Vivian Ashford, a 32-year-old woman, beautiful in a way that was cold and sharp as crystal, the daughter of an allied family whom Eleanor had already quietly marked out as the woman to marry into her own house. In Eleanor's design, Vivian was the perfect piece for Sully, a marriage not for love but for the union of two powers, and she had arranged everything with the careful precision of a seasoned chess player. That evening, Maddie was the one serving their section, and she did her job as she always did, quietly, attentively, neither too much nor too little. Everything would have passed smoothly if not for the moment when a young waitress named Haley, who had been working there for less than 2 weeks, clumsily spilled a few drops of sauce onto the tablecloth while clearing a plate. Eleanor immediately turned that small mistake into a public humiliation, raising her voice to scold the young girl in front of the whole table, calling her the sort of person unworthy of serving guests like herself. And every word that left her mouth was so sharp that Haley began to tremble, her eyes reddening with tears she was trying not to let fall. Maddie was standing nearby, and she understood all too well the fragile boundary of her place, understood that the safest thing to do was lower her head, look away, and let it pass. But she didn't do that. She stepped forward, gently placed a hand on Haley's shoulder as if shielding her, then calmly told Eleanor that she was deeply sorry for the inconvenience, that this was the team's mistake, and that she would personally take care of it. Her tone wasn't rude, but neither was it servile. It was simply steady in a courteous way that made Eleanor pause for a brief moment. To a woman accustomed to seeing those beneath her bow down, that steadiness in an ordinary waitress was no different from insolence. And it didn't end there. When one of the gentlemen at the table, already pleasantly drunk, slapped his hand down and demanded a fourth refill of wine, Maddie politely but firmly refused, citing the restaurant's policy because she knew the man still had to drive himself home, and the professional conscience of a woman on the verge of becoming a nurse wouldn't allow her to look the other way. That refusal, though spoken with the most gracious smile, made Eleanor feel that her authority had been challenged on the very stage where she always reigned. She didn't shout, and she didn't make a scene. She simply set down her glass, lifted her eyes to Maddie from head to toe with a look as cold as ice, fixing every line of the young woman's face in her memory, and lightly pressed her lips into a smile that never reached her eyes. Vivian, seated beside her, watched the entire thing, and at the corner of her gaze there flashed a spark of unreadable interest, because she realized this waitress had just unwittingly turned herself into a thorn in the side of the most powerful woman at the table. Maddie turned back to her work, her heart briefly stirred by a feeling of unease. But she didn't regret what she had done, because she believed she hadn't done anything wrong. She had only done what was right. She couldn't have imagined that in the world of people like Eleanor Greer, doing the right thing could sometimes be the most unforgivable offense of all, and that the seed of hatred planted that night would soon bloom into a storm, fierce enough to sweep away everything she had. Less than 2 weeks after that evening, fate once again brought the Greer family back to Il Ponte, but this time it was different, because Eleanor had managed to persuade Sully to bring the whole family there for dinner, using the excuse that a proper meal out would be good for the child, when in truth it was so Vivian would have a chance to sit at the same table with the man Eleanor intended to marry her into. Sully never took Poppy to crowded places, because he understood all too well that spaces like this were torture for his daughter. But under pressure from his mother, and because of one fragile flicker of hope that perhaps this time it might be all right, he agreed. And then the thing he feared came very quickly. The restaurant was crowded that night, the crystal chandeliers casting a harsh golden light, the clatter of knives and forks, the lively laughter and overlapping voices from the tables around them rushing in from every side. And Poppy began to grow restless, her small hands clutching Otto tightly, her little body rocking back and forth. Eleanor glanced at her granddaughter with a fleeting look of irritation and murmured something about how the child needed to learn how to behave in public, a remark that made Sully's jaw harden. When a server at the next table accidentally dropped a metal tray onto the floor, the piercing crash became the final breaking point. Poppy pressed both hands over her ears, her body went rigid, and she began making frightened, distressed sounds. Her eyes squeezed shut as she sank into a sensory overload that no one at the table knew how to pull her out of. Eleanor froze with embarrassment. Vivian pushed her chair back with an awkwardness hidden behind a strained smile. And Sully, the most powerful man in the room, became helpless in a way that was almost pitiful. He bent down beside his daughter, urgently calling her name, but the more he called, the more Poppy curled in on herself, because even the worry in his voice was one more pressure pressing down on her. It was in that seemingly hopeless moment that Maddie appeared. She had been carrying dishes for a nearby table, and had watched long enough to understand what was happening, and instead of panicking, she did what the instincts of a future nurse and the heart of someone who truly cared told her to do. She quietly moved to the light switch for that section, and gently dimmed the brightness by half, then signaled for the nearby tables to lower their voices. She didn't rush straight toward Poppy, didn't touch the child, didn't speak loudly. She simply lowered herself slowly to her knees at a careful distance, level with the child's eyes without staring, and began speaking in a low, slow, steady voice like waves washing against the shore, telling her that it was safe here, that the loud sound was gone now, that she didn't have to hurry for anything. Then she took the cloth napkin from the table and, with skillful hands, folded it into the shape of a small animal, a rabbit with 2 ears standing upright, and quietly set it on the floor, nudging it gently toward Poppy without pushing her. For several long minutes that felt endless, no one at the table dared move. Then, little by little, Poppy's breathing slowed, her shoulders stopped trembling, and she opened her eyes just enough to look at the napkin rabbit, reaching out one small finger to touch it lightly, before lifting her gaze to the strange woman kneeling in front of her with a look Poppy rarely gave to anyone. Maddie only smiled very softly, not celebrating, not doing anything that might shatter that fragile moment, then quietly stood and stepped back to give the child her own space. And at the head of the table, Sully Greer sat motionless, his gray eyes, which had always been cold as ice, now following that waitress with something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a silent astonishment mixed with an emotion he couldn't name, because after 2 full years and so many costly specialists, this was the first time he had seen with his own eyes a stranger reach his daughter's world so naturally. He said nothing, revealed nothing on that stone-carved face, but he quietly engraved her features into his memory, not knowing that in only a short while, the very woman who had just saved his daughter would be pushed into the center of a nightmare. But not everyone seated around the table that night looked at that tender moment with gratitude, because while Sully was quietly watching Maddie with some new and unfamiliar feeling, Vivian Ashford was watching that very thing with a cold unease running down her spine. She was clever enough to understand that the man she had been arranged to possess had just looked at an ordinary waitress in a way he had never once looked at her. And for a woman like Vivienne, that kind of threat had to be strangled in the cradle, decisively and without mercy. The opportunity came when the meal was nearly over, as Maddie bent down to clear the last plates from Eleanor's side of the table, her apron hanging loose and low against her hip. Vivienne, who was seated close to the edge of the table, had quietly removed the diamond necklace Eleanor had taken off and placed beside her water glass, after complaining that it was getting in the way. And with one swift movement hidden beneath the napkin on her lap, she slipped it neatly into the front pocket of Maddie's apron. At the exact moment Maddie leaned forward to reach for the farthest plate. Maddie had no idea. She only felt a faint, unfamiliar weight at the front of her apron and assumed it was her usual order pad and pen. Then she smiled politely and carried the stack of plates back inside. Only a few minutes later, Eleanor reached for her necklace and found it gone. She went still, swept her eyes around the table, then asked in a sharp, cold voice where her jewelry was. And when no one could answer, she slowly lifted her gaze, letting it stop exactly where the waitress had just bent down to clear the table, a satisfied smile briefly glimmering in the corner of her eyes, because the opportunity she had been waiting for had finally arrived. She called out sharply and demanded to see the manager at once, and Tom Reyes, the middle-aged manager of Il Ponte, hurried over with his face gone pale when he heard Eleanor announce that her diamond necklace, worth more than $100,000, had just vanished from the table, and that the last person standing near it was none other than that waitress. The whole section of the restaurant gradually fell silent as diners at nearby tables began turning to look, and Maddie, called back out, stood there bewildered, still not understanding what was happening. Eleanor didn't accuse her with shouting. She did it with a calmness far more terrifying, saying that she didn't want to make a scene, that all they needed to do was check the waitress, and everything would become clear. Tom Reyes stammered, trying to stop it, saying that Maddie had worked there for nearly 2 years, that she was one of the kindest and most trustworthy employees he had ever had. But Eleanor only coldly reminded him who her family was, and that if he refused to cooperate, not only that waitress's job, but this small restaurant as well, and perhaps even his own future, could disappear into smoke after a single phone call. The threat didn't need to be spoken more plainly for Tom to understand the price of opposing the Greer family, and his hands shook as he turned toward Maddie with an expression begging for forgiveness. Maddie, her face drained white, said softly that she hadn't taken anything. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away, and she willingly held out both hands, ready to prove her innocence, because she was certain she had nothing to hide. But when Tom, with shaking hands and eyes full of guilt, reached into the front pocket of her apron at Eleanor's demand, the entire room thick with silence, the crystal light caught on something glittering, and the diamond necklace slipped out of the apron pocket and fell onto the stone-tiled floor with a clear, delicate clatter that rang out sharply in the absolute stillness. Maddie went motionless, her eyes widening as she stared down at the object at her feet as though it were something that couldn't possibly exist, and for one suspended moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, because the whole world had just collapsed beneath her and she couldn't understand why. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, a flash of triumph crossing her face, perfectly hidden beneath a mask of outrage. Then she slowly raised one ring-covered finger and pointed straight at the young woman's chest, speaking the sentence every pair of eyes in the room had been waiting for, that she was a thief. At the head of the table, the 2 heavily built men standing silently behind Sully's chair shifted and stepped forward, and Sully Greer sat there, unmoving, his gray eyes revealing not a single trace of emotion, coldly watching the woman who had just saved his daughter now standing alone in the center of humiliation, while around her, the invisible noose of a world she didn't belong to slowly began to tighten. While every eye in the room turned toward Maddie in accusation, not one person noticed that all this time, a small pair of eyes had been quietly watching everything, a pair of eyes that had not looked directly at anyone all day. Poppy, still clutching Otto the otter tightly against her chest, had witnessed it all from where she sat, and with the way Poppy's world worked, she saw details that adults, caught up in the drama of their own making, had missed. Because to Poppy, every movement, every hand, every object set in the wrong place was stamped into her mind as clearly as a picture that couldn't be erased. She had seen the hand of the blonde woman sitting beside her grandmother slip down beneath the napkin. She had seen the glittering thing being moved. She had seen it disappear into the cloth tied around the waist of the kind woman who had folded the little rabbit for her. And now, as that woman stood trembling beneath poisonous words, something in the order of Poppy's world had been disturbed so deeply that she couldn't bear it, because to a child who saw life through the lens of plain truth, wrong being turned into right was a disorder that couldn't be tolerated. Poppy slid down from her high chair, something she almost never did by herself in an unfamiliar place, then took small steps around the legs of the table until she reached her father's side, and she tugged at Sully's sleeve, a gesture he knew well enough to understand that she wanted to say something important. Sully bent down, and Poppy didn't look into his eyes. Her gaze stayed fixed on the otter in her hands, but she began to whisper in her small, broken voice, in that very particular way of hers, repeating again and again that it wasn't the lady in blue. It wasn't the lady in blue. The lady in blue didn't take it. Sully went still. He softly asked what she meant, and Poppy, still not taking her eyes off Otto, lifted one small finger and pointed straight at Vivienne without looking at her, then repeated with the strange certainty of a child who had never known how to lie, that the blonde lady hid it in the belt of the lady in blue. I saw it. I saw it. Her hand went down and then came up. The words weren't smooth. They weren't orderly in the way adults usually spoke. They came in fragments and repetition, but that honest brokenness made them carry a weight no polished defense could ever match, because everyone understood that Poppy couldn't invent such a thing. She was simply saying what her eyes had recorded. The entire table went deathly still. Eleanor froze with her wineglass still suspended halfway in her hand. Vivienne, who had been wearing an expression of false sympathy, suddenly turned visibly pale, her lips parting and closing again without a sound, and her hand unconsciously tightened around the edge of the napkin that only moments earlier had hidden her crime. Sully slowly lifted his head, and this time his gray eyes were no longer empty. They moved from his daughter's face to Vivienne's steadily paling one, then swept over the necklace still glittering on the floor, and anyone who had ever seen that look knew it meant a storm was coming. Poppy, after saying what needed to be said, stepped back and pressed herself against her father's leg, holding Otto to her chest as she softly hummed her familiar melody, as though she had just set down a burden too heavy for one small soul to carry. And in that thick, suffocating silence, Maddie stood there with tears silently rolling down her face, not because she had been cleared, but because in a room full of powerful people ready to crush her without the slightest remorse, the only one who had spoken up to protect her, the only one who had truly seen her, was a 6-year-old child the whole world was used to treating as though she didn't understand life at all. Sully Greer rose slowly to his feet, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath with every movement he made, because when that man stood up in that particular way, everyone understood that control of the game had changed hands. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask long questions. He only gave Frank Boyd a slight signal, and Frank immediately stepped forward and asked Tom Reyes to pull the restaurant's security camera footage, the cameras that had been discreetly installed in every corner of the room, according to the standards of an elegant place like Il Ponte. While they waited, Sully walked around the table, stopped in front of Vivienne, and in a voice so low it sent a chill through the blood, he asked her to kindly show him her handbag and her hands. Vivienne tried to salvage herself. She let out a strained laugh and said this was an absurd joke, that surely he wasn't going to believe the words of an autistic child who couldn't tell reality from fantasy. But that sentence itself was a fatal mistake, because Sully's jaw tightened and the temperature in his eyes fell below freezing. When the footage was opened on the phone, the trembling manager handed over. Everything appeared with a clarity that couldn't be denied, frame by frame showing Vivienne's hand slipping beneath the napkin, picking up the necklace Eleanor had placed beside her water glass, then skillfully dropping it into Maddie's apron pocket at the exact moment Maddie leaned in to clear the plate. The silence broke into stunned murmurs all around the nearby tables, and Vivienne, knowing she had no way out, let her beautiful face twist for one brief instant before she tried to recover her arrogance, but it was already too late. What made the air even heavier was that Frank, cautious by nature, leaned close to Sully and whispered something that made him turn sharply toward Vivian with an entirely new look in his eyes, because the Ashford name had recently been mentioned in suspicious exchanges with the rival group trying to push into the Greer family's harbor territory, and the fact that Eleanor had brought her so close to the family suddenly carried a meaning far different and far darker than an ordinary arranged marriage. Sully didn't say everything he was thinking. He only looked at Vivian for a long moment, then said quietly that there were some debts that would be settled at the proper time, and that the night from 2 years ago perhaps had never truly ended the way he once believed. It was a vague sentence, but it made Vivian suddenly lose color in the way a person does when hearing someone mention something that should have stayed buried forever. Frank and Sully's men quietly escorted her outside, without noise, without chaos, because that was how the Greer family handled things. When order had been restored, Sully turned to Maddie, who was still standing there with tear-wet cheeks but her back still straight, and for the first time that night, his voice softened a little as he apologized for what she had just been forced to endure. Then he drew a thick stack of cash from inside his jacket, placed it on the table in front of her, and said it was to make up for the humiliation, that he would make sure this incident would never affect her job. But Maddie didn't reach for it. She looked at the money, then looked straight into the gray eyes of the most powerful man in the room, and in a small voice that was unexpectedly steady, she said she was very grateful that he had uncovered the truth, but she couldn't accept that money, because the dignity people had deliberately tried to trample in front of so many others wasn't something that could be bought back with a stack of bills. And if she accepted it, then she would be putting a price on herself in exactly the same way people like them had always looked at her. She said the only thing she had ever had, and would always hold on to, was her innocence, and that wasn't for sale. When she finished, she gave a slight respectful nod, sent one last gentle look toward little Poppy, who was tucked against her father's leg, then turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving behind a silent room and a man standing rooted in place as he watched her go. Because in all his years living in a world where everything and everyone had a price, Sully Greer had never met anyone who dared refuse his money in order to keep hold of something invisible, something he himself had lost a very long time ago. In the days after that night, something strange began to happen inside the Greer mansion, because Poppy, who rarely expressed wanting anyone at all, kept mentioning the lady in blue. She repeated that phrase at moments no one expected. At breakfast, while sitting on the floor lining her toys into rows, while getting ready for bed, she would lift her head and ask where the lady in blue had gone, and each time, Sully felt something ache inside his chest, because he understood that his daughter had found a rare thread connecting her to the outside world, a thread he couldn't bear to ignore and couldn't bring himself to sever. The situation became even more urgent when Bridget Nolan, the devoted nanny who had been with Poppy for several years, finally spoke aloud about what she had tried to hide for a long time, that her health no longer allowed her to continue work that demanded so much physical strength and alertness, that her trembling hands and frequent dizzy spells had made her afraid she wouldn't be able to manage in time whenever Poppy fell into one of her crises. Bridget left in tears, holding the child tightly one last time and telling Sully with complete sincerity that Poppy needed someone who didn't merely watch over her, but truly saw her, and that she believed he would know who that person was. The emptiness Bridget left behind placed Sully in a corner. He tried inviting a few more recommended candidates, but Poppy shut herself away from every one of them, and every morning she still asked only about the lady in blue. At last, setting aside his unbreakable rule about keeping outsiders away from his family and away from the dangerous world he lived in, Sully went to Il Ponte on a quiet afternoon. He didn't speak in circles. He told Maddie directly that his daughter needed her, that ever since that night, Poppy hadn't stopped mentioning her, and that he wanted to invite her to the mansion to stay beside the child, with a salary he believed no place else could match. Maddie's first reaction was to refuse. She wasn't naive. She had heard the whispers about the Greer name, had seen with her own eyes how that kind of power could crush a person over the course of a single dinner, and she understood that stepping into his world meant stepping into a place where the rules were unlike any she had ever known. She told him she appreciated the offer, but she had a life of her own, unfinished studies, and a path she was trying with everything she had to complete. But Sully didn't pressure her. He only said quietly that he hadn't come to buy her. He had come to beg on behalf of his daughter, and that he would respect whatever decision she made. That night, Maddie tossed and turned without sleeping, with the unpaid medical bills still weighing heavily on one side of her shoulders. with money that could help her finish her nursing degree years sooner, and on the other side, stronger than any numbers, there was the image of the 6-year-old girl who had looked up at her in the restaurant, the child who had bravely spoken up to save her when the whole world turned away, and she wondered whether she could truly close her eyes and look away from a little soul who needed her that much. The next morning, she found Sully and told him she agreed, but with clear and uncompromising conditions, that she was coming there for Poppy and for nothing else, that she would continue her studies, that she wanted to be respected as a human being and not treated as a hired servant to be ordered around, and that on the day she felt this place was no longer safe for her, she would leave without needing anyone's permission. Sully looked at her for a long while, and for the first time in a very long time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth as he nodded and agreed to all of it. And so Maddie moved into the Greer family's stone mansion, a place beautiful and cold as a museum, where long, endless hallways always echoed with the footsteps of silent men, where there were rooms she was told never to enter and conversations she was told never to hear, and she understood that she had just stepped into a world where light and darkness were separated by only a fragile thread. During the first weeks in the mansion, Maddie focused her entire mind on Poppy, and she approached the child not with rigid lesson plans like the specialists before her, but with patience and the understanding she had gathered from her nursing classes and from her own listening heart. She began by building a stable routine for Poppy, because she understood that for a child as sensitive as she was, being able to predict the world was a life raft in a sea of chaotic sensations. In one corner of the child's room, she created a safe space, laying down soft cushions, placing a few of Poppy's favorite things there, and of course Otto as well, a place Poppy could retreat to whenever the world became too loud, and she taught the child to communicate through picture cards when words became too difficult. Little by little, small signs of progress began to appear like green shoots pushing through cracks in stone. Poppy began to take Maddie's hand on her own when she wanted something, began to sit still longer during meals, and one morning, she lifted her face and looked straight into Maddie's eyes for a few full seconds, before smiling, a moment that made Maddie turn away to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. Sully watched all of it from a distance, silently, the way he watched everything, and inside the man who had once believed his heart had turned to stone, a complicated feeling began to take root, one he didn't know how to handle. But between two people who came from two opposing worlds, closeness didn't arrive smoothly. They clashed many times, because Maddie wasn't the kind of woman who knew how to bow her head, and whenever she saw the way Sully ran his life through cold control, the way he kept a distance even from his own daughter because he was afraid of hurting her, she spoke plainly. Once, she accused him of hiding behind work and power, instead of learning how to sit on the floor and play with his child, and Sully, who wasn't used to being questioned by anyone, answered with cold, cutting words, reminding her of her place in this house. Maddie didn't back down. She calmly said that if he wanted her to leave, she would leave at once, but as long as she remained here, she would always tell the truth, because Poppy didn't need one more adult who was afraid of his own feelings. That sentence pierced Sully's armor like a needle, and instead of growing angry, he only fell silent for a very long time. Gradually, through late nights when the whole mansion had sunk into quiet, a strange closeness began to form between them. Brief conversations in the hallway, moments of silence that no longer felt suffocating, but somehow became comfortable. One night, when Maddie found Sully sitting alone in the dark study with an unfinished glass of liquor, he revealed to her a part of himself he had never allowed anyone to see. He told her, in a low, rough, halting voice, that he had once had a wife, Poppy's mother, and that she had died in an accident 2 years earlier. An accident he still, to this day, didn't believe had been only an accident. He said that the person sitting in that car that night should have been him, not her, that there were enemies in his world always lying in wait, and that he had lived these past 2 years with the bitter belief that his very existence had killed the woman he loved and left his daughter with an emptiness nothing could fill. He confessed that, since that day, he had frozen his heart shut, because he believed anyone who came close to him would have to pay a price, and that the only way to protect what remained was to never allow himself to love again. Maddie sat quietly and listened to him, and she didn't hurry to comfort him with empty phrases. She only said gently that the pain he carried wasn't an excuse for Poppy to grow up without a father who was truly present, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do wasn't build more walls, but allow himself to trust once more. In that dark room, between two people wounded in very different ways. Something fragile and dangerous began to take root, a stirring they both could feel but neither dared to name, because they both understood too well that in the shadow-filled world where they were standing, allowing the heart to open also meant handing fate one more thing it could steal. But the warmth beginning to kindle inside that cold mansion didn't escape Eleanor Greer's icy eyes, and to her, Maddie's presence was no different from a crack slowly spreading through the foundation she had spent so many years building. She watched the way her son changed, the way the frozen walls around him began to fracture, the way he lingered at home longer instead of burying himself in work, and she understood at once that the reason was the waitress she had once tried to crush, who was now brazenly living under this roof. Eleanor wasn't the kind of person who easily abandoned a move on the board. She began her own campaign quietly and with great subtlety, planting hints in Sully's ear about Maddie's uncertain background, asking whether a stranger from the streets could truly be trusted near a child who carried Greer blood, then deliberately creating situations that made Maddie look as though she had overstepped her duties. She even summoned Maddie in private, and in a voice so sweet it was more frightening than any shout. She placed a check on the table with a number large enough to buy the young woman's quiet departure and ensure she would never return. Maddie looked at the check, then looked at the powerful woman in front of her, and once again she refused, calmly saying that Eleanor couldn't buy her departure because she wasn't here for money, and that if Poppy wanted her to leave, she would leave, but that decision belonged to the child, not to any bank check. That stubbornness made Eleanor even more bitter, because no one had ever dared refuse what she offered twice, and deep in her heart she began to see Maddie no longer as a small nuisance, but as a real threat that had to be removed at any cost. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the city, a far greater danger was quietly taking shape. Vivian Ashford, after being thrown out of the mansion in disgrace, hadn't disappeared as people had assumed. Instead, she went straight to the very people she had been secretly working with all along, the rival group that was hungry to swallow the Greer family's harbor territory. Cornered and burned raw by hatred, Vivian became a useful piece for them, because she held knowledge of Sully's habits, of the security layout around the mansion, of the weak points only someone who had once been allowed close would know. Meetings in the shadows took place. Whispers of a revenge plan were woven thread by thread, and what made it crueler than anything else was that they weren't aiming only at Sully, but also at the new weakness he had just revealed, the young woman and the child he now treasured. Uneasy signs began appearing here and there, like dark clouds gathering along the horizon. Frank Boyd told Sully that strange cars had been seen near the mansion at unusual hours, that one of their trusted contacts at the harbor had suddenly gone silent, and that something in the air of the city was shifting in a direction that didn't bode well. Maddie herself could also feel the tension rising inside the mansion, the silent men now guarding more closely, the doors being locked more carefully, and more than once she caught Sully standing by the window, staring out into the night with a watchfulness she had never seen before. She wasn't told the details, because that was how his world worked, but she was perceptive enough to understand that a storm was drawing near, and that the fragile peace she had helped rebuild in this house could be swept away at any moment, leaving behind consequences no one dared imagine. The first storm did not come from the enemies outside, but from inside Poppy's small, fragile soul. On a late night, when the entire mansion had sunk into silence, a sudden clap of thunder tore through the darkness, followed by a flash of lightning and rain lashing hard against the window panes, and to Poppy, that storm was no different from the whole world collapsing around her all at once. She woke in the most violent panic the mansion had ever witnessed, screaming, sobbing, pounding her hands against the mattress, rocking her body again and again, her eyes wide open yet seeing nothing but the fear drowning her. And even Otto, pressed into her hands, couldn't bring her back. Poppy's cries echoed through the long hallways, waking the whole house, and Sully was the first to run to her, but when he tried to hold his daughter, the anxious circle of his arms only made her struggle harder, because in that overload, every touch became pain. The man who had once made an entire city tremble stood there in the dark room, utterly helpless before the sobs of his little girl, his hands shaking and his face twisting with a wordless agony. It was then that Maddie appeared in the doorway. She didn't rush in. She quietly signaled for Sully to step back a little, then lowered herself to the floor, keeping a safe distance from the child, and began to hum a low, gentle melody, the very melody she had once heard Poppy sing to herself whenever she was uneasy. She didn't touch the child. She didn't pour out frantic words of comfort. She only repeated, in a steady voice like the rhythm of waves, that the storm would pass, that it was safe here, that she was right here and wasn't going anywhere. She took a soft blanket, wrapped it around her own shoulders, then gently pushed one corner of it toward Poppy like an invitation without force, giving the child the right to choose when she was ready. Time moved slowly in that room, where there was nothing left but the sound of rain and that tender humming. And little by little, Poppy's sobs began to thin. Her breathing started to match the rhythm of Maddie's voice, until at last the child crawled toward her on her own, burrowed into that woman's lap, clutched tightly at her shirt, and pressed her tear-soaked face against her shoulder. Maddie gently wrapped her arms around the child, still humming, rocking her ever so slightly, and Poppy slowly drifted to sleep inside that safe embrace, her small fingers still holding on to Maddie, as though she were holding on to the last piece of peace in the world. Standing motionless in the dark corner of the room, Sully Greer witnessed the whole moment, and something inside him, the ice he had spent 2 years building layer by layer to protect himself, finally cracked open. The man who hadn't shed a single tear since the day he buried his wife, the man who believed he had lost the ability to feel, stood there and let tears roll down the face that had always seemed carved from stone, silent and unrestrained. He cried not because he was weak, but because for the first time in a long, endless stretch of time, he was watching his daughter find peace in the arms of another human being, and he understood that what had healed Poppy wasn't the money he had poured into so many specialists, wasn't power or control, but something simple he had forgotten long ago, sincere gentleness and love without calculation. In that moment, he looked at the woman holding his sleeping daughter through the storm, the woman who had twice refused his family's money in order to keep her dignity, and he realized that what she had brought into this cold house, the gentle light his entire empire could never buy, was exactly what both he and Poppy had been yearning for, with aching hearts all along. The real storm came on a moonless night, only a few days after the fragile peace in the mansion had seemed to be rebuilt. Frank Boyd, with the instincts of a man seasoned by too much danger, had persuaded Sully to send Poppy away first. And by that very afternoon, the child had been quietly taken by Maddie and a trusted guard to a safe house in the suburbs, far from the mansion, where the thunder of the adult world couldn't reach her. And that decision saved the most precious thing in Sully's life, because that night, when only Sully, Frank, and a small group of trusted men remained in the mansion, the rival faction struck exactly according to the plan Vivian had mapped out for them. They knew the blind spots in the security system, knew which entrance was least heavily guarded, knew even the hour when Sully was usually alone in his study, all information only someone who had once been allowed close could possibly possess. The clash unfolded quickly, violently, and coldly through the dark corridors of the mansion. Sully's men fought back fiercely, and Sully himself, though caught off guard, was still a formidable opponent who wouldn't be easily broken. In the chaos, Frank was shot when he threw himself forward to shield him, falling to the floor but still struggling to hold on, and it was the sight of his loyal companion bleeding because of him that made Sully's rage ignite into a force so cold and precise it was terrifying. When the last gunshot died away, and the intruders had been subdued, a truth even more horrifying than the attack itself began to surface. While searching one of the captured leaders, Frank, though still fighting through his wound, found evidence of a communications network, and those trails led back to a place Sully never would have expected. Not Vivian, not the rival group, but his own mother, Eleanor Greer. As Sully questioned and followed those threads through that night, the final pieces of a terrible picture slowly revealed themselves before his eyes. It turned out that for many years, because of her burning desire to merge the Greer family with the Ashford family and create an empire that couldn't be shaken, Eleanor had secretly joined hands with forces she believed she could control, arranging deals in the dark that she thought would lift her son to the summit of power. And those shadowed agreements, 2 years earlier, had slipped beyond her control in the most tragic way, because the accident that took Sully's wife's life that night hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a strike meant for him, a direct consequence of the dark alliances his mother had entered behind his back. Perhaps Eleanor had never wanted her daughter-in-law to die. Perhaps she had only been a pawn who believed herself to be the player. But the naked truth remained that her ambition had opened the door for death to enter this house, and she had buried that secret for 2 full years, watching her son writhe in a guilt that should have belonged to her. When Sully faced his mother in the cold light of dawn after that terrible night, there were no shouted words, no explosive fury, only a silence heavier than any scream. He looked at the woman who had given birth to him, the woman he had respected all his life, even as he feared her. And in his gray eyes now lived a heartbreaking pain mixed with a revulsion he couldn't hide. Eleanor, for the first time in her life, could no longer keep hold of her usual pride. Her face collapsed as she tried to explain that she had only wanted what was best for the family, that she had never imagined things would go that far. But those words fell into hopeless emptiness, because Sully had understood that for 2 years he had punished himself for a guilt that was not his own, that the woman he loved had died not because he existed, but because of his mother's bottomless greed, and that the world of power his family had worshipped for so long had, in truth, eaten away at their souls down to the root. Standing amid the ashes of every illusion he had once clung to, Sully realized he was at a crossroads. On one side was the abyss of hatred and revenge that could swallow whatever was left of him, and on the other, faint but real, was another path, one that the woman named Maddie and his little daughter had unknowingly lit for him. But the nightmare of that night had not completely closed, because one of the masterminds had managed to escape the mansion, and with the vicious instinct of a cornered man, he and Vivian followed the trail to the very refuge where Poppy was being hidden, because Vivian understood all too well that the only way to truly break Sully Greer wasn't to kill him, but to take from him the thing he loved most in the world. At the safe house in the suburbs, Maddie was the first to sense that something was wrong. The sweep of headlights across the window at that late hour, the sound of tires grinding over gravel, where everything should have been silent, and the instinct of a mother who had never given birth, but had come to love Poppy as her own flesh and blood told her that danger was coming. She didn't panic. She immediately lifted Poppy into her arms, whispered into the child's ear in the calmest voice she could manage that they were going to play a very quiet game of hide-and-seek, turning danger into something the child's little soul could bear, then slipped out through the back door, crossed the dark garden, and held Poppy tightly against her chest to shield her from the cold and from fear. While the wounded guard tried to hold off the pursuer behind them, Maddie ran through the darkness with every bit of strength she had, her legs scraped raw by thorns and brambles, but her arms around the child never loosening for even a second. And when Vivian had nearly caught up, trapping her at the foot of a stone wall, Maddie turned her back and used her own body to shield Poppy, ready to take anything so the child would be safe, her mouth still softly humming that familiar melody, so Poppy wouldn't have to hear the terror closing in around them. It was in that life and death moment that Sully and his men rushed in, and he saw with his own eyes the sight of that woman using her slender back as a shield for his daughter before the enemy's gun. Something inside him was decided with finality in that very second. When he subdued the pursuer and faced Vivienne, trembling in despair, Sully Greer's entire old life urged him to pull the trigger, to end the person who had brought so much suffering upon his family, to repay blood with blood, according to the hidden law he had lived by all his life. But when his gaze met Maddie's, as she still held Poppy tightly and looked at him not with fear but with a quiet faith, he realized that if he pulled the trigger tonight, he would forever become the very thing that had killed his wife, would force his daughter to grow up under the shadow of a blood-stained father, and would extinguish the fragile light that had only just begun to glow inside his home. So Sully lowered the gun. He chose a path far more difficult than revenge. He chose to let real justice speak. The evidence Frank had gathered through the night, from the communications network to the roles of Vivienne and the rival faction, was quietly delivered to federal agents who had long been secretly monitoring the underground operations around the harbor. Vivienne and her accomplices were arrested and made to face the law, not by a bullet in the dark, but beneath the light of a courtroom, a punishment that, for the first time, Sully allowed the system to carry out instead of his own hand. When everything settled and dawn began to break along the horizon, Sully walked to Maddie, knelt beside her and Poppy in the dew-wet garden, and for the first time, he was no longer the crime boss who made the whole city tremble, but only a man, a father, reaching out to hold the two people he had nearly lost, softly whispering his thanks and a silent promise that from now on, he would do everything differently. In the months after that fateful night, the lives of everyone in this story were slowly rewritten in a way no one could have imagined. Sully Greer, the man whose name had once been spoken by the whole city in wary whispers, began doing something no one believed he could do. Step by step, he withdrew from the underworld that had shaped his entire life. It wasn't a change that happened in a single night, but a long and difficult journey. He dismantled each link one by one, moved the harbor operations into legitimate business, created honest work for the very people who had once served under him, and cooperated, within the limits he could, with the authorities to close the dark chapters of the past. He understood that he couldn't erase what he had done, but he could choose the man he would become from that moment on, and he chose to become a father Poppy could be proud of, a man worthy of the light that had been given to him. Eleanor Greer had to face the consequences of what she had caused, and though the bond of blood kept Sully from sending his own mother to prison the way he had done with Vivian, he still forced her to leave the seat of power she had clung to all her life, to live out her remaining years in loneliness, and beneath the weight of a secret she finally had to admit. On the rare occasions when she was allowed near her granddaughter under supervision, people caught faint glimpses in that proud woman of a late remorse, a small measure of redemption as she sat quietly watching Poppy play and, for the first time in her life, understood that the power she had chased all her days wasn't worth one peaceful moment she had nearly destroyed. Maddie, in the midst of all those upheavals, still didn't forget the path she had chosen for herself, and with Sully's sincere and unconditional support, she completed her studies and finally held in her hands the nursing degree she had paid for with so many sleepless nights, fulfilling the promise she had once made beside her mother's sickbed. But the greatest gift that came to her wasn't that degree. It arrived on an ordinary morning in the sun-filled garden, when Poppy, the child the whole world had once believed couldn't connect, ran to her side, lifted her face, looked straight into her eyes, and spoke the first complete sentence she had ever given Maddie, saying that she loved Mommy Maddie. Those simple words made Maddie sink to her knees and gather the child into her arms, tears streaming down her face, because she understood that the love and patience she had given for so long had finally found its way home. They married on a spring day in a small, warm ceremony, without the lavish display the Greer world had once known, with only the people who truly loved them present, and Poppy, in a little pale yellow dress, still holding Otto the otter, stood between her father and her new mother, like the final missing piece of a family. All three of them had crossed too many storms to find. At that simple celebration, a woman came to Maddie's side, one of the guests who had been present at the restaurant on the night Maddie was falsely accused, and she took Maddie's hand, emotionally saying that all this time she hadn't been able to forget the dignified way Maddie had stood with her back straight in the middle of that humiliation, that the image had forced her to look again at the way she herself had treated the quiet people who served around her. Maddie only smiled gently and answered that the one who truly deserved praise wasn't her, but a little girl who had taught every adult in that room a lesson, that truth, no matter how small or different the voice that speaks it may be, always has the power to change an entire life. And that is the deepest thing that remains from this story, that a person's dignity is never measured by status or wealth, that kindness and goodness, no matter how quiet, will one day find their own light, and that every human being, no matter how different they may be, deserves to be seen, heard, and respected as a whole person. Poppy's story also reminds us that autistic children don't lack love or understanding. They simply feel and express the world in their own way, and when we are patient enough to step into that world instead of forcing them to step out of it, we discover souls that are clear and honest beyond words. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please leave a comment sharing what you feel deep inside, because we truly want to hear what this story awakened in you. And whether you have ever met a person or lived through a moment in real life that made you believe in the power of kindness and respect, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day we can keep listening together to more meaningful and heartwarming stories about human kindness. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye. And we'll see you again in the next stories.